Inside a brown paper grocery bag that Margaret Eloise Tatum carried onto the Family Feud stage on a Friday in January 2023 was everything she had been able to take with her when her son changed the locks. 2 photographs, one of her late husband, Bernard, in his army uniform, one of herself at 31, holding a baby she had not yet named because she wanted to see his face first before she chose. A Bible with her name stamped in gold on the cover, the gold mostly worn away. A change of clothes, her blood pressure medication, and a birthday card her grandson had made her 6 months earlier out of construction paper and glue stick that said, "Happy birthday, Grandma, I love you," in letters that got smaller as they went because he had not left himself enough room. Margaret was 81 years old. She had been living at the Fresno rescue mission for 11 days when the Family Feud producers called to confirm her taping date. She told them she would be there. She did not mention the mission. She pressed her good blouse and asked the mission's intake coordinator if she could borrow an iron, and when it was time to leave, she picked up the brown paper bag and she came. It was a Friday in January 2023 at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, California. Margaret had come with her daughter Beverly, 56, who had driven 4 hours from Stockton with her husband Carl and their 2 children, Marcus, 16, and Joy, 9, when she found out what had happened. Beverly's voice, when she called Margaret at the mission's front desk after learning the truth, had been the voice of someone who is very controlled. Because if she stops being controlled, something irreversible will happen. She had said, "Mama, why didn't you call me?" And Margaret had said, "Because you have enough." And Beverly had said, in a register Beverly had never used with her mother before, "Mama, you are not a burden. You have never been a burden. Don't you ever say that to me again." And Margaret had said, "Okay, baby," in the voice of a woman who has been saying okay to people her whole life to give them peace, and who was not entirely sure she believed it. The competing family, the Abernathy family from Phoenix, were 3 adult sisters and their husbands, warm and funny and completely unaware of what they had walked into. The oldest sister, Ruth, 62, was a retired postal worker who had been watching Family Feud since the 1970s, and had informed the producers during her pre-interview that she had strong opinions about the show's question selection and was prepared to share them. The producers had noted this with the particular diplomacy of people who note things they have no intention of acting on. But nobody in that studio knew what Joy had said backstage. Joy was 9 years old. She had not been told the full story. Beverly and Carl had agreed on the drive down that Joy was 9 and some things could wait. What Joy knew was that Grandma had been staying somewhere that wasn't her house, and that some people were upset about it, and that they were all going to be on television, which was exciting enough to occupy most of her attention. Backstage, while the adults were doing the pre-show briefing with the production coordinator, Joy had wandered to the corner of the green room where her grandmother was sitting with the brown paper bag on her lap, and she had climbed up onto the chair beside her and looked at the bag, and then looked at her grandmother and said, with 9-year-old directness that goes straight past the surface of things, "Grandma doesn't have a house anymore?" Margaret had looked at her granddaughter for a moment. "Not right now, baby," she said. Joy had thought about this. Then she had taken her grandmother's hand and held it with both of hers and said nothing else, because she was 9, and sometimes 9-year-olds understand that the right answer to a true thing is not words. Margaret had held on to that hand for the rest of the green room wait. Keontae Tatum, Margaret's son, 53 years old, who had changed the locks on the house where his mother had lived for 22 years, had not come to Los Angeles. He had not been invited. He did not know there was a taping. He was, at the time of the recording, living in the house on Millbrook Avenue in Fresno with his girlfriend of 14 months, a woman named Sandra, who had moved in 8 months ago and who had told Keontae in October that the living situation with his mother was not working for her. Keontae had told his mother she needed to find another arrangement. He had given her 3 weeks. Margaret had called Beverly, who had offered her room immediately and without hesitation. Margaret had said she didn't want to be a burden. Beverly had said she wasn't. Margaret had believed her less than Beverly needed her to. Margaret had called 2 of her church friends to ask about their spare rooms. Both of them were in small apartments and genuinely could not accommodate her. Margaret had not told anyone else because she had spent 81 years believing that the shape of your trouble was your own to carry, and that asking for help was a door you opened only after you'd tried every window first. On the 22nd day, 1 day past the deadline Keontae had given her, she had still not found a place. She had gone to the house to ask for 2 more weeks. The locks had been changed. She had knocked for 8 minutes. She could hear the television on inside. Nobody answered. Margaret Eloise Tatum had stood on the porch of the house where she had lived for 22 years, where she had raised 2 children after Bernard died, where she had kept a garden in the back that she had tended for 19 of those years, where she had painted the kitchen yellow in 2008 because yellow made mornings feel more like something worth getting up for. She had stood on that porch with a rolling suitcase and the brown paper bag, and she had eventually sat down on the top step because her feet hurt, and she had sat there for 40 minutes before she called Beverly. Beverly had answered on the first ring. Beverly had driven to Fresno that night, 4 hours, arriving at 11 p.m., and found her mother sitting in an IHOP 2 blocks from the house, drinking decaf coffee and reading her Bible. Margaret had looked up when Beverly came in and said, "You didn't have to do all that." Beverly had sat down across from her and taken her hands and said, "Mama, we are going to fix this." And then Beverly had cried, quietly, into a stack of IHOP napkins, while her mother patted her hand and said, "It's okay, baby. It's okay." Margaret had spent that night at Beverly's hotel room. 3 days later, Beverly had had to go back to Stockton. Marcus had school, Carl had work. And Margaret had not wanted to come because she said she had things to handle in Fresno. The things she had to handle were a meeting with a legal aid attorney about whether she had any rights to the house, which she did not. Her name was not on the deed, which Keontae had arranged 7 years ago during a refinancing that Margaret had signed without fully understanding what she was signing, because she had trusted her son. The attorney told her this with professional gentleness. Margaret thanked her and took the bus back to the Mission. She had been there 11 days when the producers called. Nobody in the studio, watching Margaret walk in with her brown paper bag, knew that the bag was not a purse. Nobody knew the Bible had her name in fading gold. Nobody knew about the birthday card with the letters that got smaller because her grandson had not left himself enough room. But the real story hadn't even started yet. Steve Harvey's first indication that something was different about this episode came from the producer, who handed him the family brief backstage. He read it standing in the corridor. When he finished, he folded the paper once and handed it back and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long has she been at the Mission?" The producer told him. Steve said, "Does she know we know?" The producer said no. Steve said, "Good, don't tell her. I want to talk to her on stage." He straightened his jacket. He walked to the stage door. He stopped with his hand on the door and said, to no one in particular, "This is why we do this." The game began normally, or what passed for normally, on a day that was not normal at all. Margaret played with a sharpness that surprised the audience. She buzzed in fast. She knew her answers, and she delivered them in a voice that was clear and direct and carried zero apology for existing, which is the voice of a woman who has spent 81 years being precise about the things she is certain of, because she learned early that certainty was a form of dignity the world could not take from you without your cooperation. She got 3 answers in the first round. The audience loved her on the first answer and hadn't stopped since. Between the second and third rounds, Steve sat on the edge of the stage and looked at Margaret and said, "Tell me about the bag." Margaret looked at him steadily. "It's got my things in it," she said. "What things?" "The things I needed to bring." Steve said gently, "Where are you staying, Miss Margaret?" The studio fell completely silent. Margaret held the bag a little tighter. She looked at Steve for a long moment with the eyes of a woman who has decided, in the space of 2 seconds, whether to trust someone, and who is experienced enough at reading people to make that decision accurately and quickly. "I'm at a mission," she said, "in Fresno. It's fine. They treat me good." "How long?" Steve said. 11 days. The audience made a sound that was not a gasp and not silence but something between. The sound of understanding arriving. "And before that?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "My son's house," she said. "For 22 years. He needed the space back." Steve Harvey did not move for a moment, his jaw set in the particular way that people who knew him well recognized. Not anger, they would say afterward, something more deliberate than anger. He looked at Beverly, sitting in the family section. Beverly gave the smallest nod. "And that birthday card in the bag," Steve said. "Is that from your grandson?" Margaret's composure shifted. Not broke, but shifted, like something that has been held very still that moves slightly when touched. "From Marcus," she said. "He made it himself. The letters got small at the end because he ran out of room." And then Joy, 9 years old, sitting in the audience section next to her father, said it. Not loudly, not to anyone in particular, but in the way children say true things, into the open air, without preamble. "Grandma doesn't have a house anymore?" She had forgotten she already knew, or she had remembered and needed to say it out loud. Either way, the question went into the room, and the room received it in complete silence. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey stood up. "Stop everything," he said. He walked to center stage. He did not pull his earpiece out. He stood at the camera with his full height and his full stillness, and he looked directly into the lens. "I have 5 words for a man in Fresno, California," he said, "and I need everybody at home to make sure he hears them." He paused. "She raised you. Remember that." The studio held its breath. "I know what it is to have nobody," Steve said. "I know what it is to need help and not be able to ask for it because you spent your whole life being the person who didn't ask. I made a promise to God when He got me out of that car, when I went from sleeping in a Ford Tempo to standing on this stage, that I would spend whatever time I had left making sure that people who deserved to be seen got seen. This woman," he turned to look at Margaret, "has been seen her whole life by the wrong eyes. She raised 2 children alone after her husband died. She kept a garden for 19 years. She painted her kitchen yellow because yellow made mornings feel worth getting up for. She carried a Bible with her name in fading gold and a birthday card with letters that got small because her grandson ran out of room. She has been sleeping at a rescue mission for 11 days, and she showed up here today in a pressed blouse with her whole life in a grocery bag. And she answered every question right, and she didn't ask a single person for a thing." He stopped. "We are going to fix this today," he said to the camera. "And then we are going to build something so that the next woman who ends up sitting on her own porch step because someone changed the locks on her doesn't sit there alone for 40 minutes. He turned to the floor director. Get me a phone. I want Keontae Tatum. The floor director looked at the booth. The booth looked at the floor director. A production assistant walked to Beverly, who had the number, who gave it without hesitation, who had been waiting 11 days for someone to make this call. It rang 4 times. On the 5th ring, a man's voice answered, guarded, the voice of someone who doesn't recognize the number. Hello? Steve Harvey said, Keontae, my name is Steve Harvey. I'm calling you from the Family Feud stage in Los Angeles. Your mother is standing next to me. She's been at the Fresno rescue mission for 11 days, and I need you to hear her voice. 12 seconds of silence. Then, she didn't have to go there. She had options. The audience made a sound. Steve's voice stayed level. She knocked on your door, he said, for 8 minutes, with a suitcase. You were home. The TV was on. Silence. Keontae, Steve said, I'm not calling to embarrass you. I'm calling because this is your mother, and she has not said one unkind word about you in this building today. Not one. And she carried a picture of you as a baby in that grocery bag, because even right now, that's what she chose to bring. I'm asking you to be the person she raised. 22 seconds of silence. The longest 22 seconds in the recorded history of the Family Feud stage, according to the segment producer who timed it later. Then, very quietly, Can I talk to her? Steve handed the phone to Margaret. Margaret held the phone in both hands, the same way she held everything important. She listened for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she had used with Beverly in the IHOP, the one that said, It's okay, it's okay. I know, baby, I know. What happened in the next 9 minutes is between a mother and her son. The cameras ran, the audio was captured. The network made the decision later not to release the full call, only that it happened, and what came of it. What came of it is this. Keontae Tatum drove to Los Angeles the following day. He and his mother sat in Beverly's hotel room for 3 hours. He is not in Beverly's house now, and the situation is not resolved the way resolutions look in movies. Clean and complete and final. But Margaret is not at the mission. She has been in Beverly's spare room in Stockton since the 18th of January, 2023. And the room has a window that faces east, and Beverly put yellow curtains on it because Margaret mentioned once, not to Beverly but to Carl, that yellow made mornings feel worth getting up for. And Carl told Beverly, and Beverly bought the curtains the same afternoon. But Steve wasn't done. He stood before the camera after the call, and he talked for 17 minutes. He talked about elder homelessness. 50,000 Americans over 60 experiencing homelessness on any given night, the fastest-growing segment of the homeless population in the United States. He talked about the specific legal vulnerability of elderly parents in informal housing arrangements, living in children's homes, not on deeds, not on leases, with no legal standing when the arrangement ends. He talked about the 40-minute wait on a porch step, and what it costs a person to sit there, and what it costs a society to allow it. He turned to the Abernathy sisters. Ruth, the oldest, the retired postal worker with opinions about question selection, stood up without being asked. Whatever you need, she said. Whatever it takes. Her 2 sisters stood up beside her. Their 3 husbands stood up beside them. Both families won. The Tatum family received the top prize. The Abernathy family received a separate arrangement from the network. Ruth told a producer afterward that she had no opinions about the question selection today and that this had been the best episode of anything she had ever watched. The Margaret Dorr Foundation was incorporated in California in April 2023. Its founding mission was threefold: legal advocacy for elderly parents in informal housing situations, emergency bridge housing funding for seniors displaced from family homes, and a document review program, free of charge, to help elderly people understand what they were signing before they signed it. The Foundation's document review program, in its first year of operation, flagged legally disadvantageous arrangements for 2,300 seniors across 12 states, before those arrangements were finalized. The Foundation's Housing Bridge program provided emergency placement support for 1,800 displaced seniors in the same period. By the end of 2024, the Foundation operated in 31 states and had been cited in 4 pieces of state elder care legislation as a model for community-based legal protection. The clip of Steve Harvey saying, "She raised you, remember that," into camera one was posted to the Family Feud YouTube channel on a Monday morning. It reached 60 million views in the first 24 hours, the fastest the show had ever reached that threshold. The full taping crossed 240 million views in 17 days. The hashtag #SheRaisedYou trended globally for 7 days and was the top trending term in 11 countries simultaneously. The clip was cited in a New York Times feature on elder housing insecurity and was shown during testimony before the California State Assembly's Committee on Aging and Long-Term Care. Margaret Eloise Tatum still has the birthday card. It is no longer in the brown paper bag. It is on the windowsill of the east-facing room in Beverly's house in Stockton, next to the yellow curtains, where it catches the morning light. The letters still get small at the end because Marcus ran out of room. And Margaret still tells people this with the particular pride of a grandmother who has decided that the running out of room is the best part, because it means he had more to say than the space allowed, and he said all of it anyway. The brown paper bag she folded and kept. It is in the drawer of the nightstand beside her bed. She does not need it anymore. She kept it because it is the bag that carried her here. Some people are put out of houses, and some people are welcomed into rooms. And the difference is not always the people involved. Sometimes it is simply who found out and who showed up, and whether someone thought to hang yellow curtains on an east-facing window. The things Margaret carried in that bag were not small things dressed up as large ones. They were exactly as large as they were. A man she loved in a uniform, a baby whose name she hadn't chosen yet, the Word of God with her name in fading gold, a card that ran out of space. That is the whole inventory of an 81-year-old woman's life, and it fit in a grocery bag, and she pressed her blouse and carried it onto a stage, and she answered every question right, and she did not ask anyone for a thing. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to know that showing up matters. Leave the word yellow in the comments so we know who stayed until the end. And if you know a senior who is in an informal housing situation, who is living in a child's home, not on the deed, not protected, the Margaret Dorr Foundation's document review program is free, and the link is in the description. It takes 20 minutes. It could change everything. Because nobody should sit on their own porch step for 40 minutes while the television plays inside.